Thank you, Araceli, and thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today for our discussion of multidisciplinary approaches to teaching and researching climate change. I'm Lisa Brelia. I'm a Senior Associate Dean and Associate Professor of Global Affairs in the College of Humanities and Social Sciences at George Mason University. And I'm a co-organizer of the panel, and I'll let my other co-organizer and co-facilitator introduce himself.
Hi, I'm Padhu Seshayar. I'm an Associate Dean for Academic Affairs in the College of Science and also a Professor of Mathematical Sciences and work with the SDGs. So I'm very excited to co-host this with Lisa.
Thank you so much. We're going to introduce our panelists in just a second. But as we begin, we want to honor and preserve the histories and stand in solidarity with the Indigenous peoples who have historically inhabited the lands where George Mason University sits. We respect and honor their lineages and efforts to reclaim their lands and foster as much reconciliation as humanly possible. And we honor the following tribes who inhabit the land in Virginia: the Pamunkey Indian tribe, the Chickahominy, Eastern Chickahominy, Upper Mattapony, the Rappahannock, Nanasimond, and Monacan. And I think that remembering and honoring Indigenous patrimony is especially important given the issue that we're discussing today, climate change. I myself have had the privilege of working with Indigenous communities, specifically among them Maya farmers in Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula over the last 20 years. And I've witnessed the effects of anthropogenic climate change on their ability to sustain their lives and livelihoods amidst a host of intersecting factors, most curiously cartel activity, and most recently COVID. Climate change is indeed a multidimensional issue. And today we have the opportunity to see how Mason's teaching and research efforts work at the intersections of these issues of our efforts to understand climate change from a multidisciplinary perspective. Padhu, will you tell us about our speakers for today?
Wonderful. Thank you, Lisa. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today for having this discussion on a very important topic. And to navigate us through this topic, we have a diverse group of speakers, diversity in expertise, diversity in experience, diversity in perspectives they're going to be bring today, all related to climate change, whether it is research, curricular innovations, community transformations, outreach, and much more. So this group of experts that you're going to listen to, and hopefully you will ask questions and learn from, they focus on everything from energy and environmental policy making to public health and climate change communication to human environmental interactions to advancing equitable climate action through interdisciplinary approaches. So multidisciplinary, multidimensional, multi-transformational. So welcome, everyone. So we are excited to have you all here. To start us off, I'm going to invite Ed Mayback, who's a Mason Distinguished University Professor and Director of Mason Center for Climate Change Communication. He is a communication scientist and a public health professional who, for the past 15 years, has focused exclusively on averting the climate crisis. And let's hear from him and let's learn together. Ed, I'm going to share your slides in just a second, okay?
Thank you, Padhu. So as Padhu suggested, I'm a communication scientist by training, and I came to Mason about 13 years ago to create the Center for Climate Change Communication as both an academic think tank as well as a do tank. So if you like to think of our work as both in part to figure out how best to help Americans recognize the risks that we face from climate change and recognize the opportunities we face by embracing climate solutions. When we started the center about 13 years ago, this statement was absolutely true, that most Americans understood at that time that climate change was happening. However, they saw it as a distant threat. distant in time. So most Americans would be thinking that climate change was something in our future, but not something in our present. Distant in space, perhaps occurring in some part of the world that people know the name of, but couldn't necessarily find on a map. And fundamentally, perhaps most importantly, people saw it as distant in species. Clearly the polar bear was then and is still now seen as the iconic species being threatened by climate change, but relatively few Americans back then understood that climate change was also threatening people. And that's a bit of a problem, because when we see our problems as a distant threat, we tend not to prioritize them. Padu, if you go to the next slide, please. We've learned from our research that, while climate change is clearly a complex topic, for those of you who have expertise in climate science, how incredibly complicated, complex the Earth's climate system is. But when it comes to understanding climate change and in a way that makes it, raises its priority for you as an individual, really turns out there is only 5 key beliefs that differentiate the Americans who get climate change and are rolling up their sleeves to get involved in promoting or pursuing solutions, and those who don't. And those five essential beliefs are also absolutely fundamentally true. They're based on the reality of what we know from climate science. And those 5 beliefs are: it's real, namely climate change is a reality, it's happening. It's us. It's not just part of the natural cycle of things, but this time it's very much caused by human activities. That the experts have long since been convinced, based on the evidence, that human-caused climate change is a reality. In other words, there is agreement among the experts that it's serious. It's not just a threat. While of course threats to plants, penguins, and polar bears are serious, in this case, it's also a serious threat to people. And finally, that there's hope, that there are actions that we can take that will make a difference, that will help to prevent the further destabilization of our climate. So our research has shown that Americans who understand these 5 key ideas are much more likely to support an assertive public response to the problem, and are also much more likely to be getting involved in promoting those responses. The next slide, please, Padu. For those of us who are in the field of communication, we know it's risky to talk about what the public thinks, feels, or does, because the public, especially in a country as diverse as America, is always complicated. It's always diverse. There are many, many publics within the general public. In our research, we found that, in fact, there are 6 distinct ways of seeing climate change out there among the American people. And they range from the group on the left of this slide that we call the alarmed, who are currently about 1 out of 4 Americans, who are profoundly concerned about climate change. They understand the key facts, and they are getting involved in a variety of different ways to pursue solutions. And on the other side of the continuum is a group that we call the dismissive, who also feel very strongly about climate change, but they have been misled. By sort of a well-organized misinformation campaign that's been implemented over the past many decades in America and other countries around the world. They've reached the entire wrong conclusions based on this misinformation campaign, but they feel very strongly about the conclusions they've reached. The segments in the middle, they are all essentially, as implied by their names and by their position on the 6 Americas continuum. They hold these views, but to a lesser degree. So the concerned are like the alarmed, only less so. The cautious are like the concerned, only less so. The important thing I want you to take away from this particular slide is that fewer than 1 out of 10 Americans really fundamentally reject the fact that climate change is real or human caused or a serious concern. Most Americans are really maintain, even if they don't fully understand the situation, their minds are still open. So now that's sort of a brief overview of what we do to understand, to research public understanding of climate change. Just very briefly, we also, the do part of the Center for Climate Change Communication is we develop programs to try to help Americans better understand the situation. So we have a program where we support TV weathercasters as local climate educators. They are very much focusing their effort on the 4 segments in the middle, from the concerned to the doubtful, to help them understand that climate change is already happening in their community now. And the kinds of impacts of climate change are not particularly good. In fact, often they're quite dangerous. We have another program led by former Congressman Bob Inglis, targeting the doubtful and dismissive segments of Americans. Bob is a former Republican congressman from South Carolina. As a conservative American, he's doing outreach to other conservative Americans to try to help them understand that being on the wrong side of climate science is bad for the party, bad for the country, and bad for the world. And finally, a little bit later in the hour, you'll hear from my colleague, Colin Knackerman, who's supporting our work activating health professionals to tell the story of how climate change is harming our health today, which, as it turns out, is a story that all 6 of those Americas are interested in. But more importantly, we're supporting health professionals also tell the story about how climate solutions are health solutions, and health solutions that pay benefits immediately as soon as we start to implement these climate solutions. So that, in overview, is a brief encapsulation of what we do at the Center for Climate Change Communication. So I turn it back to you, Padu.
Thank you very much, Ed, for that enlightening, ideas that you shared. Especially, I always like the word hope. I think that important word is something that can definitely enhance our belief system about climate change. So thank you for sharing all those great ideas. Lisa will now invite the next speaker, and I'll get the slides ready. Thank you, Ed. And as I feel free to keep typing your questions on the chat for the speakers. And of course, the speakers can jump in and respond on the chat also, but we'll keep some questions at the end also. Thank you. Lisa.
Yeah, and again, to emphasize what Padu said, we're going to get back to your questions in the chat. Let's see, our next speaker is Dr. Jennifer Scleroux. Jennifer Scleroux is known to her students as Dr. Jen. She's an assistant professor in Mason's Department of Environmental Science and Policy, and she's coordinator of the Masters of Science concentration in energy and sustainability policy and science. For more than a decade, she has applied her research and teaching to her prior 15 years of experience as an energy policy practitioner and analyst. She focuses on transdisciplinary challenges and integrative solutions at the nexus of climate, energy, water, and food, from community to global scale. So welcome, Jen.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I have a crazy last name, so that's why I'm Dr. Jen. So I'm so happy to join you all to talk about climate change making. And I know we understand that transdisciplinary thinking is needed to solve the climate crisis. So at a global scale, how does UN Sustainable Development Goal 13, taking urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts, connect to the other goals? So these other SDG goals may include drivers of climate change, interlinked challenges that affect climate change and sectors or aspects such as food, hunger, health, water, justice, and others, additional complexities to consider, and potential for integrative solutions. So my teaching and research, as Lisa mentioned, focus on the nexus of climate change, food and agriculture, water, and energy. So this encompasses goal 13, but also goal 2, ending hunger, achieving food security and improved nutrition, and promoting sustainable agriculture. Goal 6, ensuring availability and sustainable management of water and sanitation for all. And goal 7, ensuring access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all. So my teaching and research approach this nexus from global to local scales, and I lead 2 community level projects that target the global goals for climate change in the context of the nexus with food, energy, and water. Next slide, please, Padu. So one of these projects examines interlinked local challenges that reflect global ones. And this project, the FUSE, or Food, Energy, and Water Solutions Project, examines the relationships between climate change, food production, energy production, and water availability and use challenges in rural agricultural communities. And the faculty student team that I lead comes from environmental science and policy, sustainability studies, food and nutrition, public health, and all flavors of engineering. We are interviewing farmers, NGOs, and local government officials to understand what linkages they're seeing between changes in weather patterns, flooding and drought, and other climate change related influences on energy and water use in agriculture. And we're also examining the roles of energy use and agricultural practices in contributing to climate change. And connected to these patterns and roles, we are also learning about the community's knowledge of these connections and their willingness and ability to make behavioral or technological changes to adapt to climate change and or reduce their impact on climate change. So in some communities, we're finding a lack of awareness of the connections between agricultural and energy practices and climate change. For example, deforestation, use of diesel generators, and fertilizer use. And in some cases, even when a community is aware of these linkages between their actions and climate change and the effects of climate change on their livelihoods, they can be resistant to changes in established practices. So listening to community observations and concerns can help us to shape how we work with these communities to address their challenges and find new ways to meet their needs without contributing to climate change. Providing information on small scale renewables, including agri-voltaics, can help these communities to explore climate friendly options they may not have considered. So agri-voltaics is the co-location of solar PV panels with agriculture, and the panels can provide shade for livestock, shade tolerant or water stressed crops, and they can also reduce the amount of water needed for irrigation. Next slide, please. Thank you. So my second project also focuses on integrative community level solutions to climate change, water, and energy challenges. And I'm leading a faculty student team to design and deploy hydropower microturbines in stormwater mitigation systems, energy and water insecure communities, coupling them with solar panels and battery storage to leverage wet and dry days. And our team comes from environmental science and policy, sustainability studies, geography, economics, physics, again, all flavors of engineering, and global affairs. And by capturing the energy produced by flowing water in the stormwater systems, the turbines can provide electricity for small scale applications such as cell phone charging stations, emergency lighting, and mini refrigerators. We're conducting our first pilot in the stormwater mitigation system on George Mason University's relatively energy and water secure Fairfax campus, enabling us to examine the technological, ecological, geographical, socioeconomic, and institutional parameters for turbine design and use. And we'll use the turbines and panels to power cell phone charging kiosks. In energy and water insecure communities, diesel generators are often used to charge cell phones, and the turbines installed in stormwater systems coupled with solar panels would enable communities to avoid use of diesel generators that contribute to climate change and would also mitigate the variability of water flows and flooding that are exacerbated by climate change. We're examining pilot potential in the US and other locations, obviously beyond George Mason University, and also overseas locations that do face energy and water insecurity. So each location will have unique features. So the technological, ecological, geographical, socioeconomic, and institutional parameters will differ. And we will work within and with the communities that we select to understand these parameters and their energy and water needs, climate change effects, enabling unique turbine designs tailored to each location. So both of these projects reflect transdisciplinary thinking about climate change and its relationships with food, energy, water, and health at the local level. Next slide, please, Pedro. And this transdisciplinary thinking must be coupled with a focus on justice as the core of our thinking and actions. So climate justice, food justice, energy justice, and water and environmental justice are all central. And I'd like to focus on 3 pillars to empower transdisciplinary change makers to achieve justice in all of these aspects: education, partnerships, and policy processes. So in education, I'm talking about 2-way education, communities educating policymakers and partners, not just the other way around. And I'm also talking about change makers educating one another. So at Mason, we have a new MS concentration in energy and sustainability policy and science, as Lisa mentioned. And that concentration will help change makers to share their knowledge and gain the tools they need to address climate, energy, and other sustainability challenges in a transdisciplinary way. So 2 courses that I designed and teach, energy policy and the food, energy, water nexus, which also should be called the food, energy, water, climate nexus. But when the nexus was developed, it didn't have climate in the name, but it does now. And the textbook does as well. So anyway, these 2 courses are included in the concentration, along with a range of other courses that approach climate change and sustainability in different ways. And when I talk about partnerships, I'm talking about changemaker partners working within and with communities to understand climate and related challenges and collaborate on solutions. So the FUSE project I described earlier is an example of such a partnership. And finally, when I talk about policy processes, I'm talking about enabling community input and green workforce training to promote climate justice, food justice, energy justice, and water and environmental justice, and local jobs. A recent publication that I co-authored with many other change makers by the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, SDSN, it's called the Zero Carbon Action Plan, describes many of these recommendations for climate action and justice across every sector that intersects with climate change. It's a very long report. With these 3 approaches to transdisciplinary thinking, education, partnerships, and policy processes, we are empowered, and we can empower change makers in local communities all the way to global leaders to achieve justice in climate, food, energy, water, and the environment. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Jennifer. That was really good. And I was a program director of the NSF, and Infuse was one of the very popular programs. So I'm very happy to hear about your project. So thank you very much. So we've heard from an expert in communication to policy, environmental science policy. Our next speaker is going to help us connect archaeologists and how they can actually help us understand climate action. So we actually have Jamie Clark, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology. She's an archaeologist who conducts research on human-environment interaction in the deep past. Her research is aimed at understanding the factors that account for the success and spread of our species relative to the Neanderthals and other archaic human groups. She's offering a new course at Mason called the Archaeology of Climate Change, which focuses on the contributions that archaeology can make to our understanding of the past, present, and the future of climate change. Looking forward to hearing from you, Jamie. I'll open your slides and you can start talking.
Hi, yes, I do. I feel a little bit out of place here because my research is so focused on the deep past. So the research that I do generally focuses on things that are happening in human evolution between 80 and 25,000 years ago. And it's a little bit hard to argue how the research that I do is directly applicable to understanding climate change today. But I'm also here as a representative of the field in archaeology, the field of archaeology in general, because archaeology itself does actually have a lot to offer to our understanding, as Padu said, of past, present, and future climate change. But when I was looking at the sort of goal 13, climate action, and sort of thinking about how archaeology fits within that goal, I was looking actually at the specific targets. And target 13.3 says the goal is to improve education, awareness raising, and human and institutional capacity on climate change, mitigation, adaptation, impact reduction, and early warning. And I think this in particular is an area where archaeology has a lot to offer. We can provide a long-term record on not only the nature of climate change, so data from archaeological sites helps us build that long-term record of sort of what is happening over the long term, over hundreds of thousands or even millions of years in human evolution. How has climate been changing? Understanding how humans have been responding to those changes in climate, but also looking specifically at impacts humans themselves have had on the environment. So again, really looking at those feedback loops between environmental change and human activity. Among other things, the archaeological record can provide data on ecological baselines. So what is the climate-driven shape of ecosystems prior to human intervention? There's been a lot of debate in the broader literature about the Anthropocene, what is it and how early does it begin in human prehistory? And this is something where archaeologists have played very active roles in those debates. But archaeological specimens also provide key data on past population history and health. That's true for human populations based on analyses of the human skeletal record, but it's also important for key prey species. So for instance, I have done work with marine mammal ecologists who are working with walrus bones and bones of other important prey species to indigenous people in the Arctic, looking at those remains from archaeological sites over the past 6,000 to 20,000 years to track like walrus feeding ecology and how it has changed during periods of sort of warmer and cooler climate. Or for instance, in looking at caribou migration, looking at bones from archaeological sites to track how caribou migration patterns have changed as climate has changed. And hopefully that data that we're getting from the archaeological record will then allow us to sort of better model and better understand how these key prey species are going to respond to the changes in climate that we're seeing today. And that then can help us come up with strategies for the sort of the living groups who are still reliant on those species for their subsistence today. I think in general, in terms of thinking about the sort of paired human impacts and human response, we can actually see, looking at the archaeological record, how past societies have both succeeded and failed in responding to climate change. And I think both of those cases are potentially informative to us, even if the scale of change in the past was not quite the same as what we're seeing today. Charles Redmond, who's an archaeologist who's based at Arizona State, actually wrote a book called Human Impacts on Ancient Environments in 1999 that I was assigned as an undergraduate when I was just starting in the field. And then I now use it in my own teaching. But one of the points that he makes in that book, which was written for more of a general public audience, but it's also really useful for undergraduate teaching, is that the archaeological record is particularly important because it can inform on the cultural filters and institutional frameworks that again and again have inhibited otherwise very successful societies from accurately perceiving the problems that beset them and acting to remedy them in a timely fashion. And this is, of course, something we are grappling with today in terms of sort of getting the decision makers and the change makers on board to recognize what is happening with climate change and to sort of come up with solutions while we still have time. And again, looking at past groups can help us sort out some of those things. And what we're looking at here on the right side of the slide, I guess the font has become quite small, but there was an article that actually just came out in Nature, Ecology, and Evolution a month and a half ago, called Mobilizing the Past to Shape a Better Anthropocene. And it came out of a group from the Max Planck for the Science of Human History in Jena, Germany. And what they did in that paper was they sort of tracked all of the different ways that looking at historical data can contribute to a better present, ranging from, again, these studies of past biodiversity to prehistoric fire ecology, soil management, agriculture, and sustainable development in general. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So really my contribution, so I actually am new at Mason, and I was very excited to come here given the sort of multidisciplinary research on climate change that is happening. But for the last 8 years, I was at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, which is also a forefront of research on climate change, both past and present. And over the last 2 years, I've been developing a course, which I have now brought to Mason, called The Archaeology of Climate Change. And that class is focused on sort of providing the students who are in the class, which is a combination of sort of upper division undergraduates and master's level students, to help them be able to understand and address how archaeology can actually contribute to our understanding of past, present, and future climate change. Because we don't just focus on sort of the study of climate change in the past, but we're also focusing on the way that the changes in climate that we're witnessing today are impacting the preservation of cultural heritage. Because there are many places where, because of rising sea level, increased storminess, erosion, archaeological sites and cultural heritage is being lost at a very quick rate. And archaeologists are involved in a lot of research, or a lot of work on the ground with local and indigenous populations, working to sort of document those changes and save cultural heritage, which is really important. And it stresses that one of the things the class stresses is the importance of interdisciplinary research into climate change, public outreach, and again, work with local and indigenous communities. The class is open to students in all disciplines. It's actually just offered as a trial course now. And right now I have 20 students who are mostly anthropology and sociology focused. But I'm really hoping moving forward as it gets offered, and it will either be offered every year or every other year, to get students from some of these other disciplines that we're hearing about here at Mason, so that we can really have those interdisciplinary perspectives in thinking about how the past can inform the present. And that is all I have.
Thank you very much. That's really great to learn. I'm looking forward to the class actually. Lisa.
Great, thank you so much. And our next speaker is Colin Knackerman. Colin is the Associate Director of Policy and Operations at the Medical Society Consortium on Climate and Health, based out of the Center for Climate Change Communication here at Mason. He has also worked part-time with Mason's Center for Ocean, Land, Atmosphere Studies for the last 7 years, helping with climate research and teaching. He's a part-time Mason master student in the interdisciplinary studies in energy and sustainability. And he has spent the last decade working in interdisciplinary climate and energy issues, both professionally and through grassroots activism. So take it away, Colin.
Thank you so much. And thanks everyone for being here. I'm excited to kind of both be on a panel with several of my colleagues and talk about interdisciplinary climate work, which is my favorite thing, but also to bring some of the student perspective and how I think there's the benefits to taking interdisciplinary approaches and having those experiences available to students at the university. So I'll talk a little bit about the consortium and then some of my own research and highlight how we approach problems with multidisciplinary teams and research. I first want to just briefly mention some of my experiences here at Mason because I originally came here in 2012 as an undergraduate and was able to originally come to study environmental policy, but was able to take a climate science class and become really interested in learning more about climate science. And then see Ed, my boss here on the call, talk about the climate communication aspects of how we tackle climate change. And intern with Ed and others at the Center for Climate Change Communication. And then use both of those to go on to work on Capitol Hill and intern on Capitol Hill and use those experiences to translate science and science communication into policy. And so it's a unique science communication and policy approach that we're able to provide students here at Mason. Briefly, I'll just mention, as Ed mentioned, one of the programs at the Center for Climate Change Communication is the Medical Society Consortium on Climate and Health. As Ed mentioned, we focus to organize, empower, and amplify the medical community on the issue of climate change. And in thinking a little bit about how, while we're not always the ones doing the research ourselves, our approach is really important in taking research and data and various disciplines and approaching it from the as Ed mentioned, the think and do tank, the kind of do part. And so we have a really multidisciplinary team of communicators, of policy experts, of communication, of doctors on our team. And one of the just examples I like to share because it's so relevant to so many people is about allergies. And of course, it might be seen as kind of one of the less serious impacts of climate change on health. But because it impacts so many people, I think it's a good example. And it also involves so many different fields of science. And so as you may be aware, research has shown since 1990, pollen seasons are starting about 20 days earlier on average. They're lasting 10 days longer, and they're featuring 20% more pollen in just the last 3 decades. This, of course, has ramifications for a lot of people in their work and their health, but especially those with asthma and other respiratory issues. And when we talk about something like allergies and asthma, we have to pull in a lot of different expertise from different fields. We have to talk about how climate change and understanding the science of climate change is changing our seasons and changing the length of seasons, but also the impact that that's having on trees and foliage and why that's increasing pollen counts. And then at the same time, talking about how that's impacting people's lungs and doing the hard research on how allergens impact lungs. And then finally, moving to what that means on a broader level, and especially talking about the social science research behind the disproportionate impacts that this is having on communities with higher levels of asthma. As you may know, Black Americans are 40% more likely to have asthma than white Americans, and about 3 times more likely to die and be hospitalized from asthma-related illnesses. And so our role is to really talk with patients, policymakers, and others to help them understand these broad implications. And of course, that's one small example. There's lots of other ways that you might be aware that climate change impacts people's health across the US. Doctors use this information. We work, the consortium represents 34 medical societies across the US, and we have groups active in 14 states. And they work to help educate their patients, other medical professionals, and policymakers on these issues, on the health impacts of climate change and the benefits of taking action on climate change and what it means for our health immediately. So as you can see from this map, this obviously changes from region to region, but there's lots of examples that you can see and we talk about with policymakers to help localize the impacts and help people understand how it's impacting them already today and how it might in the future. And so another good example of this that is a little bit more recent is some of the doctors we work with have done research to show how extreme heat and air pollution affects pregnant women and newborns, and especially among Black women in the US, and the disproportionate impacts that's having on the health of newborns and pregnant women. And this actually, their research, they actually worked with policymakers to introduce the Protecting Moms and Babies Against Climate Change Act, which was just introduced recently. So the research on the health impacts is becoming a lot more tangible for policymakers and patients, and we're working to help amplify that. And lastly, kind of a totally different issue that I'll mention, but I think it's just more on my personal research that I'm doing in my master's program with the help of Jen Scalurua, actually, who's on the call, who is one of my committee members. This is the first time we're kind of showing this data, but over the last year, we've worked to survey students here at Mason about a variety of issues and how COVID has impacted them. But one of the questions that we asked and did content analysis on is what issue or issues most strongly motivate you to take action, to take political action, like voting, joining a group, or advocating on an issue. And we found from a sample of about 270 students that healthcare and climate change and environmental issues and social issues generally were among the most prominent issues that motivate students. And so I mention this because not only is it great to see that from my perspective, that those issues are among the most important for students, but also in thinking of how we take kind of a non-traditional approach, is my program here at Mason allows me to produce a non-traditional product. And so we're taking a lot of what we're learning about students and activists and how COVID has impacted their their outlook on climate change as an issue and how it may change climate activism, and producing a website and other kind of more public-facing materials to help share stories of students and activists. And so just taking a kind of non-traditional and interdisciplinary approach to this project. So I will stop there and thank you.
Thank you so much, Colin. I was thinking, and let me turn my video on. I was thinking that a common theme that cuts across a lot of this multidisciplinary work is the effort to address precisely what you were talking about here at the end, what I would call the differential effects of climate change. So how climate works in a field of difference. So whether if we go back to where we started today with Ed, differences in understanding and perception, or the field of social difference, where you see effects on marginalized populations, the field of social difference, or for Jamie, differences across space, but across time, or for Jen's work, also with different populations, also facing the effects of social differentiation and marginalization. I think all of you kind of work with that theme. So, and I think everybody did a really nice job of bringing that out. If you thought you were doing that or not. And I'm wondering, since we're talking a lot about multidisciplinarity, sometimes in my own work, I think, wow, you know, that method someone else is using, or a method or technique or ideas that someone else is bringing to their work, if I had that in my work, I could bring a shade of nuance to what I'm doing. And because in this work, because of its import, because of the motivation we all have to look for solutions for the dilemmas of climate change, did anyone get inspired, you know, to say, you know, does anyone get inspired in their work in thinking, you know, I could kind of add this to what I do, or I could add a new dimension, or add a kind of different interdisciplinary flavor, or partner in a new way in terms of what I teach or what I do in my research. So I'm wondering if each of you could think about, could tell us in just a minute or so, you know, if they've done that before, or if they think about doing that in their work. And then we'll turn it over to our audience and work through some of their questions in the remaining few minutes. So we could start with, yeah, Jen. We'll start with Jen.
I can say that, you know, my work as a practitioner for years, for almost 2 decades before I came to do research, focused primarily on energy and also the nexus of climate. And environment was sort of there, water was sort of there, health was sort of there. And then as I started to do research, all of that kind of came together in this transdisciplinary way, you know, where each of these areas affects the other and how they're all interconnected. And that's one of the reasons it's been so important to me to promote that in the concentration and in the courses I teach, and also to examine it in my research. And while we were listening to everyone's presentations, I've already told Jamie I'm now going to send her syllabus on archaeology of climate change to my students, because I think, you know, many of them may not think about that framing. And it wasn't a framing really that I sort of thought about it, especially because my son is interested in paleontology, but I hadn't really thought of it as a different angle of framing for that human dimension of climate change that it would be useful to, I think, many change makers who are so that is definitely something that I want to consider in my future work.
Thank you for that. Others from the panel want to?
I'll happily jump in. And Lisa, in response to your question, let me make the following point. as communication scientists, we understand that our task is to understand how people think about information and how we can help organize information to help them make better decisions going forward. But we, by necessity, we have to work with the content experts. Like Colin, for example, talked about what public health and medical professionals understand about the human health implications of climate change. So communication scientists and medical professionals, in this case, collaborating to find better ways of helping members of the public and policymakers understand the issue so that they will make better decisions. We do the same in working with climate scientists and a whole variety of different audiences. But it's really, you know, from a communication research perspective, we're all about team building with both the content experts as well as with professional communicators who have the ability to get information out more effectively to people who can benefit from it.
Thank you for that. Jamie.
Yeah, and I'll just say, I mean, I think that one of the, you know, I think everybody recognizes the importance of sort of interdisciplinarity here, but I think that archaeology and archaeologists historically have done a really bad job at getting the word out about the things that we can offer to the study, and not just to other scientists, but also to the public and to policymakers. And again, that's one of the things about that's exciting about this kind of activity, bringing people together from different fields, but because I do think it would be really important for me to have more interaction with the folks in the climate change communication group, you know, and with people who are actually doing sort of applied policy work. I think that's useful for my students. I think that's useful for myself as an archaeologist who's doing this kind of research. So I think these connections, it's hard to find, it's hard to make them because we get in our silos. And I think it's so important for us to actually sort of find ways to get out and sort of cross those bridges.
Colin, thank you, Jamie. Colin.
Yeah, I totally agree with what's been said. And I guess in my experience, I feel like, especially as an interdisciplinary master's student who is kind of really taking classes in just every different field and discipline, and I wish I could have taken Jamie's class. But it, you know, it's kind of a constant quest to learn about new methods and approaches from different fields. And for example, one that has been really interesting to me, both in my professional work and now in my my thesis work, is you know, the storytelling and kind of that approach to talking about climate change and how powerful it can be, and all the literature that there really is existing there behind that. And so I think, and that's a good example of one that overarches across so many different fields and is useful to so many different fields in learning how to best tell stories about what people are doing on climate change and what how we can imagine a better future with action on climate change.
Thank you so much for that. And I think we're gonna go to our audience. Padu?
Yeah, so I think I just want, I mean, and add the fact that we are all virtual, Colin, that makes it digital storytelling. So it's becoming more important. So not just the understanding, you know, everything around climate change, but being able to actually digitally communicate is going to be a very important thing. And so, which brings me to a common question. And before I read some of the questions from the audience, you probably know that the Biden-Harris administration has committed to climate change. You know, being a former program director and having funded several projects on workforce development, one of their goals is actually on creating jobs, building infrastructure, and delivering environmental justice around climate change. These are the three-pronged areas that they're going to be funding projects on. So one of the ambitious goals that President Biden has proposed is, you know, while empowering, you know, workers and businesses to lead a clean energy revolution, there's a goal to achieve carbon pollution free power sector by 2035. And also it puts the US on a irreversible path to a net zero economy by 2050. I'm actually curious on your thoughts on this ambitious goal by the administration. Ed, you want to start, or anyone here?
Yeah, my thoughts are kind of irrelevant, but I can tell you, because we survey on this all the time, the thoughts of the American people are strongly behind that vision. the public gets the fact that fossil fuel energy is dirty energy, that when we burn it to run our cities, our homes, our cities, our economy, it pollutes our air and our water, and it's bad for our health. So there's this really powerful sense that a clean energy economy is the best future for America, because it's the healthiest future for America and Americans and people around the world. So I just, it's like the happiest, most hopeful news that I have to share today, which is that the American people are really solidly behind President Biden on this.
Great, great. Anyone else wants to comment on this? Jennifer,
Sorry, I don't have a hand raised button on my screen. So anyway,
your second project aligns very well with this idea.
Yeah, so I will say, again, having worked in policy making for years and then doing research on it and working with students, I've been waiting for this time. I worked on the Asia Pacific Clean Development and Climate Initiative decades ago, and there were sectors that were very concerned about any shifts: steel, cement, petrochemicals, in addition to the power sector. And the power sector is really where my work had focused, but now, having also started to look at the agricultural sector, I'm looking at other aspects as well. And I think what's really critical, and I mentioned this in my talk, the two things that I think are new that are really critical are this focus on justice, which really didn't have prominence before. We had an environmental justice executive order that I teach my students about every semester. And then I always had to check and see if the agencies were actually doing what they were supposed to do. But now there's this really front and center focus on justice and energy justice. So linking those two, I think, is one of the things that makes a big difference in terms of power sector involvement and those communities hosting those facilities. And then the other is the emphasis on jobs, which I believe, other administrations have also talked about the growth in jobs, but not talking about jobs, which I also mentioned in my presentation, I think really leaves out a key component of what can move this clean economy forward, because it is a clean economy. We're not just talking about decarbonizing, we're actually talking about job creation and innovation.
Great. Any other thoughts, Colin?
Yeah. Well, first, it's great to hear. I mean, I've really enjoyed the focus on workforce development, and I worked for about 1.5 years on a Department of Energy solar workforce development grant, and it's been so amazing to see the Department of Energy completely shift its focus towards equity and climate action, which was a change even from the Obama administration. So I think it's really optimistic, and you can tell there's a really, as they say, a whole of government approach to tackling climate change, and it is so optimistic. And I think after working in the renewables field, I do think it's really possible. And just last week was at a conference where the renewables folks are just focused on deployment. We have the technology available. Other countries are beating us in deploying that technology that's already available. And we just have to incentivize it to make it happen. And so my hope is that we'll do that in the next year or so, be able to do that in the next 2 years, and hopefully aim for carbon neutrality before 2050. Because I think actually before this administration announced that plan, there was a lot of talk about how the US needs to be there before 2050, because as our fair share of our carbon emissions, of how much historically we've emitted, if the planet needs to be on the right track, the US actually needs to reach carbon neutrality before 2050 and before other nations are able to do that. So hopefully we'll see that conversation reemerge.
Great. So, and one thing you mentioned is everybody's going for these fast solutions. I'm a big believer of first have a problem statement clearly defined before you go for a solution. So I think that's probably where we can also make a difference on what is the right problem that we want to attack. Otherwise, we'll be solving the wrong problem and getting a solution to a completely wrong problem. So that's great thoughts. So I'll move to asking some questions from the audience. There was a question to you, Ed, from Ann Glover. And the question was, Anne was curious if you have the racial makeup of the sample. Do the pictures of the individuals and the pictures relate to that?
Yes, so it's a bit counterintuitive, but the demographics don't vary all that much by across the 6 Americas. We tried to keep in mind those pictures. We've been using them since we first did this research 12 years ago now. But we actually just looked recently to see if the demographics had shifted much. They haven't. We did our best to represent the modal individual in each of the 6 Americas with a photo. And thus why you saw the alarmed as represented by a woman, because at that time and still more females are alarmed than males. And we represented the dismissive with a sort of an older or a white male. You've probably heard of the white male effect. Much of the climate denial in America is driven by white males. So we tried our best to represent the groups. It does not show a particularly demographically diverse America. America is a demographically diverse place, but if you represent the modal individual in each group, it's usually going to be a white person. The biggest driver of where a person falls in the 6 Americas is their political ideology. So that the dismissives are almost entirely conservative Republicans. The alarmed are almost entirely liberal Democrats.
Thank you.
Thanks for answering that question. And the interesting thing sort of goes back to those earlier comments, though, like how different communities though do feel effects of climate change disproportionately, so that we have perceptions of climate change being and our understandings of climate change represented in one way, but the effects of climate change being felt disproportionately in different ways. So there's sort of mismatches in different ways. And I feel like maybe the audience was definitely picking up on that. So that was really great. So I think we had an earlier question for Jen, and this was from Siobhan, and she wanted to see if Jen could share a little bit more about the integrative community level solutions project with the turbine charging stations. And Jen, I don't know if that's like a quick answer or if you have like a resource we could direct Siobhan to, but just let us know.
So I will give a quick answer, and I already mentioned in the chat that I can, if she provides her contact information, I can send her a longer piece. But basically, this project came about because I was really interested in communities that were unable to access electricity, but also unable to access clean water, and maybe had flooding and drought-related issues, all of which revolve around climate change, right? So the thought was to figure out whether we could design really small turbines, because a lot of the ones that are being sold are big. Even if they're called micro turbines, they're still big, that these communities could use for very local community level energy that would allow them to shift away from using diesel generators and also mitigate the stormwater issues. So that's where the project came from. And then the students are actually designing the turbines themselves with input from faculty. And then we're also researching all of those other aspects: economic, institutional, geographical, ecological, et cetera. All the different faculty and students are working, we're all working together to do that. So that's the very short answer. If you have follow-up questions, I'm happy to answer them. And I can also send you a one-pager if you're interested.
Thank you, Jen. And there was also a question to you from another person. I'm looking for the person in the audience, but Rafael Pinho, there was a comment on average that you were talking about, and I think the person wanted to know if it was modal, and if you could give some numbers, or like how many interviews, the sampling technique you used, etc. So
that's to me. Yes.
Oh, it's to you. Yes. Yeah.
So the research was originally done on about 2,500 people. I put a link in the chat to that original paper. We have since interviewed like 25,000 people. We conduct these nationally representative surveys every 6 months with about 1,000 to 1,250 people per wave of the survey. And we actually developed a very short instrument to identify a short survey instrument consisting of only 4 questions so that other researchers and other communication planners can study their target audience and identify the distribution of the 6 Americas in their target audience, whether that's in Peoria, Illinois, or whether that is the employees of a given corporation. So we've designed this tool, and it allows different people to study different audiences. Trust me, this is about the most well-researched piece of information in the climate change communication field there is. And I'm really happy to say that often we get a lot of positive feedback, because it really does help to clarify the diversity of views out there. And the one thing I didn't mention is that over the past 5 years, there's been this huge increase in the proportion of the alarmed Americans. They've gone from about 12 or 13% of the population 5 years ago to, as you saw, 26% now. So they've doubled in size over the past 5 years, whereas the dismissive segment on the opposite end of the continuum was also about 12 or 13% 5 years ago, and they have contracted now down to about 8 or 9%. So I'm happy to say America's headed in the right direction with regard to understanding climate change. And I don't, I think it is no accident that the Biden administration is really leaning into this issue, because they understand the American people are behind them on this issue.
That's great. And this is fantastic. And talking about numbers, I'm just curious, this could be any of the panelists. We've talked about workforce, we've talked about adults, and we talked about how students and beyond, like undergraduates and all, should change their mind. I direct a center that works with several school districts here. I'm curious, climate science as a class, how early should that be taught in K-12? I'm just curious, when should children start learning about this? Anyone?
I can't speak to the climate science issue, but I can speak to the climate change issue. I think, we have an obligation to teach our children about this. But I don't want to scare them. I actually want to empower them. I have a 9-year-old friend on Twitter. She lives in Denver. I found out, and I found out she lives in Denver because yesterday she met with Vice President Harris. This 9-year-old, she's just a fierce eco warrior, constantly producing petitions calling for better public policy. And this kid, she's my hero. I love her. And the fact that she tweeted out a picture and she tagged me of her meeting with Vice President Harris yesterday in Denver. It's like, wow, that is a really, really amazing story of why we do need to teach our children about our changing climate. And we definitely, while we need to tell them the truth, we don't want to scare them needlessly. We want to empower them, because the reality is adults listen to children more than we listen to each other. So I really, Greta Thunberg and my young friend and other youth leaders, they're really the ones who are moving this issue forward.
Thank you. Yes, Jen.
So I will say, I have twins who are now teens, early teens, and I've been talking to them about climate change since they were 2 years old, because I was taking courses on climate change when they were 2 years old, and they wanted to know where I was going. And their response when I explained the world is getting hotter, they were 2, so the world is getting hotter and I want to learn a bit more about it and how to fix it. And my son said, I will help you fix it with a lawnmower. So I thought, okay, wait a minute, deforestation. So we talked about deforestation actually as a result of that, and native plants and all this other stuff. But both of them are now leaders in the eco club that their school has, and they're talking about building an outdoor classroom and the importance of water, water security and water quality, and how climate change is related to that. So kids I think they want to know these things, and it's possible to do it without scaring them, just providing them the tools that they can use to then scare their parents, because the parents might need to be scared. So it's been really interesting seeing my kids interacting, because I make the assumption sometimes that the other kids they're interacting with are equally aware, and they're not always equally aware. So my daughter led a rain barrel a rain barrel activity at her school, and a lot of the kids didn't even know what a rain barrel was. So she was explaining what it is. And so I think empowering change makers at that level of, and I know I was corresponding in the chat with at least one person in the audience who's working with elementary school age kids, empowering those kids to understand that they can be change makers too. And they can not just talk to their parents, but they can actually engage in community level activities. I think it's really important.
Great, great. Hey, Jamie, yes.
Yeah, so I was going to say, I mean, in terms of thinking about these, we've talked multiple times now about like social justice and environmental justice and different sort of cultural perspectives on climate change and responses. And one of the things that always shocks me is that in most public school systems in the United States, even at the high school level, students don't get exposed to anthropology or sociology. And I think both of those disciplines are so important in sort of conceptualizing these issues of sort of justice and disparity and cultural variation. So I think in terms of thinking about the climate science, I mean, I think that's a piece of the puzzle that students need to get exposed to as well. And I think having those things be incorporated at least at the high school level, if not earlier, is really actually important.
Great, great. Yes, Colin.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think as someone who started, learning about climate change because it hit my town and wildfires in Southern California when I was 12, and that's what originally got me interested. I think there's a lot of value, in addition to everything that's said, value in teaching young people, ways to actually cope with it too, because it's an increasingly challenging mental health issue for young people. And that's part of what I've tried to understand through my research. And there's I'll just give a shout out. There's a great professor at Humboldt State University wrote this book, A Field Guide to Climate Anxiety. And she provides kind of tangible methods because she was experiencing in her undergraduate class that young people that were learning about climate change for the first time were just so distraught that she is trying to develop ways to teach and help young people learn about climate change in a way that doesn't lead to disparity and doomism and still leads to a lot of hope. So I think it's really important to start that as young as possible, as young as appropriate, and help make sure it doesn't continue on that path.
Great, great. So there is a question that came to on the chat to me. So I'm just going to read out the question and anybody can answer. We have about less than 5 minutes. What is a positive strategy for removing political labels, Democratic, Republican, etc., for the discussion of climate change? Sounds political already, so that's great. How can we have a positive participation from across the political spectrum? Anyone can take this.
We have a whole program in our center called Republic EN, which is a play on the word Republican. And as I said previously, it's headed by Bob Inglis, a six-term Republican member of Congress from South Carolina, who actually lost his job in Congress in 2010 because he had introduced climate legislation. As a Republican from the most conservative district in South Carolina, he introduced that legislation in 2009, and he lost his job in 2010 because dark money, the Koch brothers' money, mobilized against him. He had four or five different challengers in his primary after representing his constituents well for 6 terms in Congress. And Bob's response to that, rather than running away with his tail between his legs, was to lean into it and say, hey, okay, this happened to me. I'm sorry I lost my job because I loved my job, but it's really important, that conservative Americans like me don't understand the reality of what the science is telling us. And his view is the Republican Party is the party of ideas. And the party of ideas should be leaning into this and bringing the best ideas forward about how to address the problem. And he was the first voice of his type, but increasingly there are what they call eco-right organizations being formed to reach out to fellow conservative Americans across the country. Because again, to be on the wrong side of reality is not good for anybody. And real conservative Americans understand that, and they do want to bring the best thinking forward to address the problem. And we're starting to actually see that in Congress now.
That's great. That's Great. So that's wonderful. So I think you've given anyone else in the panel who wants to share any comments on the political aspect? Colin?
Yeah, well, I'll just give a shout out to Ed's research, and you may have just mentioned this, Ed, but just showing how the health message really can reach moderates and conservatives, and we've had some experiences with that in having discussions with even policymakers and discussing ways that climate is already impacting the health of people in their district can be a lot more effective approach rather than saying talking about ecosystems or just things that are less tangible to them, and especially when we can translate it into economic costs, which is of course the most important thing to policymakers, which is hard to there's a big role for economists and others in that too.
Great. And I think that question was from Stephen Fox. I forgot to mention the name of the person who asked that question. So on the chat. So great. I mean, you clearly have demonstrated, all of you have demonstrated why, especially Colin with your wildfire, the comment that motivated you to think about climate change. So there's always a context, a real world context around us, the community around us that actually motivated you to think about taking some action. And so how that translates to a curriculum and then to a content we integrate, then the concept we teach, how we teach it, and then we think about the competencies of the workforce, right? The critical thinking, creativity, communication, collaboration. So I think very nice way you all brought it together. Lisa, any final thoughts?
No, I just really appreciate the time of participation of our panelists. I also truly appreciate the participation of our audience. They're inquisitive and active, and I hope that everyone has a fantastic rest of your Ashoka Exchange Conference, and hope to see you in various other venues as well.
Thank you all. Thank you very much for coming.
Thanks, everyone.
We have about a minute if you want to chat. Or that.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you for the good questions.
Yeah. Thanks to the hosts.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody. This was great. Much appreciated.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, guys. The panelists, it was fantastic. Clearly created a lot of discussion, and Lisa, thank you. This was great. I think seamlessly it went very nicely, Lisa.
Yeah, thank you very much, moderators, slide movers, and introducers. You guys did everything. That was really helpful. Thank you.
I know it's always all up to the screen sharer, so that was Paju. So
yeah, so yeah, everything all three of you were doing to help us behind the scenes and in front of the scenes. Thank you.
I think the message was, I think you definitely delivered some powerful messages. That's the takeaway messages that they had. I think is very, very good. So, and I see it.
Yeah, I got a private message from Siobhan asking me to help her with a project she's working on with elementary school age kids. So it was kind of ironic. The question you asked about children came right as she sent me that message, and I was like, wait, was that to everyone or was that just to me? No, it was just to me. So Padu, you have ESP.
No, I work with, and teachers ask me all the time. So feel free to, maybe we'll connect also on this. Developing class.
Yeah, it was just funny, the timing of your question. Anyway,
Okay.
That was great.
No, I didn't know that. So.
well, thanks again, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Arceli. Okay.
Yeah, thanks, all.
Take care.